You know, when you look at a towering skyscraper or like a massive suspension bridge.
Right, you see the steel cables?
Exactly. You can literally touch the concrete pillars. You know exactly what is holding that massive structure up.
It is physics. I mean, it is engineering. It is a tangible, undeniable reality.
It is solid. If someone asks you, why does not this bridge fall down? You just point at the steel. But then you look at the entire global economy.
Oh, yeah, the really big picture.
Right. I mean, we are talking trillions of dollars moving across borders every single second, mega cities being built, global supply chains running 24/7, and you try to find the concrete holding that up, and
And there was nothing.
there really isn't any. It is completely invisible. So today, on this deep dive, we are answering one of the most quietly radical, deeply strange questions in human history. And that question is, what actually is money?
Which is funny, right? Because we almost never ask that question. Money is just, well, it's the water we swim in.
Oh, absolutely.
We structure our entire lives around acquiring it, saving it, spending it. But when you trace the entire arc of economic history, from prehistoric shell trading all the way to modern cryptographic tokens, a really profound realization emerges.
What is that?
We are looking at an architecture built almost entirely out of shared imagination.
Okay, and here is the real aha hook for you listening right now.
Yeah.
The story of money is not actually about economics. It is not about trade at all.
No, it's not about math or finding the right shiny rock.
Right. It is fundamentally the history of human trust. It is the story of how a species of primates learned to cooperate with total strangers.
And every single monetary system we're going to explore today, I mean, whether it is ancient clay tablets or heavy gold coins or the digital code in your banking app right now,
Yeah.
it depends entirely on a shared belief that the thing has value. And history shows us repeatedly that when that collective belief vanishes, the money becomes worthless literally overnight.
Even if it has the king's face on it.
Exactly. It does not matter if it is stamped by an emperor or backed by a massive central bank.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really understand money, we actually have to unlearn the very first thing most of us were taught about it.
The good old Economics 101 textbook.
Yes. If you ever took that class or, read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, you were taught a very specific origin story. You were taught the myth of barter.
Right. The standard textbook narrative requires you to imagine this sort of prehistoric village.
Okay, paint the picture for us.
So a farmer has a surplus of wheat, but he needs a new hammer. So he wanders into the village market, finds a blacksmith who happens to need wheat, and they trade the wheat for the hammer. Pure spot transaction barter.
And the textbook says this was incredibly inconvenient because of something called the double coincidence of wants.
Right, the double coincidence of wants. It is a mouthful, but it just means, what if the blacksmith does not want wheat that day?
Yeah, what if you want shoes?
Exactly. Then the farmer has to go find a cobbler who wants wheat, trade his wheat for the shoes, and then take the shoes back to the blacksmith. It is a logistical nightmare.
It sounds exhausting.
It does. And so, to solve this nightmare, humanity supposedly invented money as a universal medium of exchange. Is a very clean, highly logical progression.
But there's a massive problem with that story, isn't there?
A huge problem. The anthropological record contradicts it completely.
Wait, completely?
Completely. Anthropologists like the late David Graeber spent years looking for historical or archaeological evidence of these pure barter economies between strangers, and they came up empty-handed.
So these great barter economies where neighbors just casually met in markets to trade goods with no common medium of exchange?
They just do not exist in the historical record.
That is wild. So if we were not haggling over chickens and shoes, what were early human communities actually doing?
Well, you find something far more socially complex. You find what anthropologists call gift economies.
Okay, what does that mean? Like everyone was just being really generous.
Not exactly. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss studied this concept, which he termed the gift, in ancient societies ranging from the Pacific Islands to the forests of Central Africa. And he observed that giving a gift in these communities was not an act of pure charity.
It wasn't just being nice.
No, it was a rigorous, highly complex economic mechanism. When you gave a gift, you were actively initiating a cycle of obligation.
Okay, so say I am a hunter-gatherer and I give you a significant portion of the mammoth I just took down. I am not just being a benevolent neighbor.
Exactly. You are actively putting me in your debt.
All right.
Look at it logically. You have a surplus of meat. Without refrigerators, it is going to spoil anyway.
Right.
So the most rational economic decision you can make is to store that surplus value in me.
Wow. So I'm basically using you as a meat fridge, but for social credit.
That is a great way to put it. The recipient is now indebted to the giver, and that debt must be repaid at some point in the future.
Does it have to be repaid with meat?
Not necessarily. It does not even have to be an item of exact equivalent value. It just has to be something that honors the relationship. So I might give you some flint tools next month or, help you build a shelter next year.
So instead of a marketplace of strangers haggling over chickens and shoes, it was more like keeping a mental spreadsheet of favors you have done for your friends.
What is fascinating here is that the relationship between the giver and the receiver was the ledger.
The relationship itself.
Yes. The community's collective memory functioned as the entire accounting system. This was a highly sophisticated credit system operating thousands of years before formal banking institutions even existed.
And the fuel for that entire engine was just trust.
Pure trust. You had to trust that the community would remember your contribution, that obligations would eventually be honored, and, crucially, that chronic freeloaders, people who took but never gave, would face social ostracization.
Right, they would get kicked out of the village.
Essentially, yes. So money, in its earliest conceptual form, did not replace barter. It replaced the memory of the community.
That is such a profound shift in thinking. The memory was the money. That changes how you view early human interaction entirely.
It really does.
But there is a glaring mechanical limitation to a system built purely on memory, right? I mean, it works flawlessly when you live in a village of 50 people.
Sure, you know everyone's grandmother. You know who is reliable and who isn't.
Exactly. But what happens when you need to trade with a stranger from a different tribe? Or like a merchant who sailed across an ocean? You cannot rely on a mental spreadsheet with someone you are literally never going to see again.
Right, because human memory does not scale.
It doesn't scale at all.
Yeah.
So we needed a physical stand-in.
And that limitation is the exact friction point that forced the first major evolution in money. To cooperate across vast distances and with much larger populations, human beings needed physical stand-ins for that community memory.
An abstraction.
Yes, something tangible that could carry the trust for us when interpersonal trust did not exist.
And when you look at the historical record, the sheer variety of objects human beings have used as this physical stand-in is just staggering.
Oh, it is amazing.
Take cowrie shells, for instance. These are these small, glossy shells found primarily in the Indian Ocean, but they were utilized across a massive geographic footprint. I mean, from ancient China around 1500 BCE, stretching across Africa, South Asia, and they even appear in indigenous trade networks in North America.
And there is a very specific reason for that. Economists identify 6 core properties that make a specific object function effectively as money. And cowrie shells happen to meet the physical requirements beautifully.
What are those properties?
Well, first, they are durable. They do not rot like grain. Second, they are portable. You just string them on a necklace. Third, divisibility. You can easily count out 5 or 50 of them.
Okay, durable, portable, divisible.
And fourth, they're relatively scarce. You could not just pick them up anywhere on land. Acquiring them required significant labor and maritime trade.
Right, you can't just print more shells in your backyard. But it wasn't just shells, right? We used all sorts of things.
Oh, definitely. We used salt, which possessed immense intrinsic value before refrigeration because it preserved food. It was a matter of basic survival.
Wait, didn't Roman soldiers get paid in salt?
They did. They were frequently paid in salt rations, which is actually where we get the English word salary.
No way. That makes so much sense.
Right. And we also traded obsidian, which is this incredibly sharp volcanic glass. Archaeologists have tracked obsidian from the island of Sardinia, spreading all the way across the western Mediterranean thousands of years before the Bronze Age.
Mesoamerican cultures used cacao beans. North American tribes used wampum beads.
Exactly. So we have established the physical properties: durability, portability, divisibility, and scarcity. The fifth property is recognizability.
Meaning, I can just look at it and know it is real.
Yes. A merchant needs to glance at the object and immediately verify its authenticity. But the sixth property, this is where the mechanics of money become deeply philosophical.
Okay, lay it on me.
The sixth property is social acceptance.
The shared hallucination.
Precisely. I mean, think about gold. Gold did not become money just because it is a shiny, non-corrosive metal. It became money through a long, complex social consensus where human beings collectively agreed to imbue that specific arrangement of protons and electrons with high status.
We just all agreed it was valuable.
We did. And no historical example isolates the sheer psychological power of social acceptance better than the ray stones of the Yap Islanders in the western Pacific Ocean.
Oh man, the Yap stones. This is one of my favorite stories from the research. So, for everyone listening, picture a tropical island where the local currency consists of massive carved limestone discs with a hole in the center.
And when you say massive, we're not talking about a heavy coin.
No. Some of these stones are relatively small, sure, but others are massive. We are talking measuring 12 feet across and weighing several tons.
You are definitely not putting a Yap stone in your pocket to go buy fish.
Exactly. So how did they even use them?
Well, they were rarely moved. Many were situated deep in the jungle or simply resting outside a prominent family's home. And the value of a ray stone wasn't determined by its utility. I mean, limestone is not particularly useful.
Right.
Its value was determined by its history. The sheer difficulty of carving it on the neighboring island of Palau and the perilous ocean journey required to bring it all the way to Yap.
So the Yap stones are essentially a prehistoric physical version of a shared Google Doc or like a modern blockchain ledger.
That is a perfect analogy.
Everyone on the island sees the stone, everyone knows its history, and everyone knows exactly who owns it. If I want to buy your plot of land, I don't hire a team of oxen to drag a 3-ton stone to your yard.
That would be ridiculous.
Right. We just announced to the village, hey, that big stone by the palm tree now belongs to the expert. And the physical location of the stone never changes. The village simply updates their collective mental ledger.
And there's a famous historical account that just proves this entirely. There was a ray stone that was being transported by boat from Palau when a severe storm hit. The crew was forced to abandon the stone, and it sank to the bottom of the ocean.
Oh no. So the money was gone.
Well, that is the thing. Because the crew survived, and they testified that the stone was indeed carved and was lost at sea through no fault of their own, the community agreed that it still existed in the abstract.
Wait, really?
Yes, it still held value. Generations later, families were still trading ownership of a stone that no living person had ever seen, resting comfortably at the bottom of the Pacific.
That is unbelievable.
It perfectly isolates the concept of money as an abstract ledger of value. The physical object is largely irrelevant. The communal consensus is everything.
But, okay, while physical objects, whether we are talking about towery shells or giant stones at the bottom of the ocean, they solve the problem of scaling memory across distances. But they introduced a severe friction problem for high-volume, everyday trade, didn't they?
They absolutely did.
Because if we are trading unstamped chunks of silver or bags of salt, I have to verify the purity and weight for every single transaction.
You have to literally bite the silver. You have to calibrate a scale every time you buy bread.
And when a market scales to thousands of participants making rapid transactions, that verification process creates a massive bottleneck. The whole system chokes on its own physical weight. They needed an authority to guarantee the value so the participants did not have to think about it.
Which is exactly the problem that ancient Mesopotamia solved around 3500 BCE in the region that is modern-day Iraq.
The Sumerians.
Right. The Sumerians built some of the world's first massive urban centers. And at the heart of these cities were the great temples. These temples functioned as massive administrative hubs. They collected grain. They employed weavers, managed agricultural workers, paid soldiers.
So they were functionally the world's first central banks.
They really were. But how do you run the logistics of a central bank thousands of years before paper or electricity?
You use clay.
You use clay. They kept meticulous accounts on cuneiform clay tablets. And the Sumerians utilized silver as their primary unit of account. A specific weight of silver, which they called a shekel, was legally equated to a specific bushel of barley.
Okay, so a shekel equals a certain amount of grain. But the physical silver rarely changed hands for everyday transactions, right?
Exactly. For transactions between the temple and the citizens, the silver just sat there.
Wait, so the first banknote was not paper at all, but a cuneiform clay tablet tracking a silver debt.
Yes. If you are a weaver working for the temple, you are not walking home with a pocket full of silver chunks. You are walking away with a recorded credit. A debt was simply etched onto the clay tablet in terms of its silver value.
So money, in this highly advanced urban economy, reverted to being an abstract measure used to compare debts, just administered by a centralized bureaucracy.
Exactly. The physical solution to the friction of trade, the actual object you could hand to a stranger without a scale, arrived a bit later, around 600 BCE in Lydia, which is located in modern-day Turkey.
And the Lydians are credited with inventing the first true metal coins, right?
They are. The Lydians had access to a naturally occurring river alloy called electrum.
What is electrum?
It is a natural mix of gold and silver. But the true genius of the Lydian innovation was not the metallurgical discovery. It was the political technology they applied to it.
Political technology. I like that phrasing.
They stamped the electrum pellets with the official seal of the king. Often it was a roaring lion.
By stamping the metal, the state is effectively saying, you do not need to weigh this. You do not need to test its purity. The king personally guarantees that this piece of metal contains a precise, standardized amount of wealth.
And that changes everything. It drastically dropped the cognitive overhead of commerce. You could just count the coins. 1, 2, 3, done.
It is a social and political revolution.
Truly, it allowed the state to pay armies, collect taxes, and fund public works with unprecedented efficiency. It finalized the creation of the anonymous market, where strangers could trade across borders, relying entirely on the authority of a third party, the state's stamp.
And it caught on like wildfire. Athens began minting their famous silver owls, featuring the goddess Athena on one side and an owl on the other, which became the dominant trade currency of the Mediterranean.
And over in China, they independently developed bronze coins with square holes in the center.
Oh, right. So merchants could easily string them together for transport.
Exactly. But, the moment you give a state the monopoly power to stamp money, you introduce an incredibly dangerous temptation.
The temptation of debasement.
Yes. Because the sovereign ruler controls the mint, they also control the specific ratio of precious metal to base metal melted into the coin.
So if the king is running low on silver, he can just water it down.
Exactly. And if you look at the Roman Empire, it serves as the ultimate historical cautionary tale of this mechanic. By the 3rd century CE, the Roman state was vastly overextended. They had a sprawling empire to defend, endless military campaigns to fund, and massive infrastructure to maintain.
And the state treasuries simply did not have enough silver to pay the legions.
Right. So emperors began a quiet, desperate policy. They melted down their silver denarius coins and mixed in cheaper, abundant metals like copper.
During the 1st century, a Roman denarius was approximately 90% pure silver, right?
Yes, very pure. But by the late 3rd century, during what is known as the crisis of the 3rd century, the silver content had dropped to roughly 5%.
Wait, from 90% down to 5%?
Yes. They were functionally creating money out of thin air by debasing the currency's intrinsic value while still demanding it be accepted at face value.
But you cannot mandate economic reality. I mean, the merchants in the markets were not foolish. They realized the coins were mostly junk metal.
Exactly. So if a sack of grain used to cost 1 denarius, the merchant now demanded 20 of these new diluted coins.
And prices skyrocketed.
This is the mechanical reality of hyperinflation. As the state printed more nominal currency, the purchasing power of that currency collapsed. Citizens lost confidence in the denarius entirely.
What did they do?
People began hoarding whatever older, pure silver coins they could find, and local economies reverted to localized barter, or demanding payment in physical goods. The economic connective tissue of the empire severely contracted.
It is a pattern that repeats itself relentlessly across history. We impartially see this as a recurring theme of state overextension. But as human civilization progressed, and empires grew larger, and international trade routes like the Silk Road expanded, relying entirely on physical coins became a logistical nightmare.
Oh, absolutely.
Carrying chests of silver across a desert or on a violent sea was exceptionally heavy and highly susceptible to robbery. But parallel to that logistical problem, a profound moral and theological crisis began to emerge around the very concept of finance.
This is a fascinating pivot. In the medieval period, both Christian Europe and the Islamic world maintained strict, dogmatic prohibitions against usury.
Which is the practice of charging interest on a loan.
Right. Now, to a modern listener, a bank charging interest is just the basic physics of the economy. It is completely normal.
Yeah, try getting a mortgage without it.
Exactly. But the theological reasoning in the Middle Ages was completely different. Money was viewed conceptually as a sterile object.
Sterile, like it cannot reproduce.
Yes. Think about it from an agrarian perspective. A cow is fertile. It can produce a calf. A handful of seed grain can produce an entire field of wheat. But a gold coin cannot naturally reproduce itself.
So putting gold in a box does not make more gold.
Right. Therefore, extracting more gold from a loan than was originally given was seen as an unnatural parasitic extraction. The medieval church articulated this as a sin against time.
A sin against time? That is so poetic. What does it mean?
The logic was that a lender charging interest is essentially making money simply by letting time pass. But time belongs exclusively to God. Therefore, selling time was a theological crime.
Okay, but this raises an important question. How do you run a booming transcontinental commercial spice trade without credit and interest?
It is a massive problem.
Because if I am an Italian merchant and I want to sail from Venice to Alexandria to buy a fortune in pepper and silk, I need immense capital to fund the ship, the crew, and the provisions. Nobody is going to lend me a chest of gold for a highly dangerous year-long voyage out of the goodness of their heart.
Right. They need an incentive to part with their capital and take on that risk. Commerce inherently demands credit. Without credit, large-scale trade just freezes.
So what did they do?
Faced with these absolute religious prohibitions, merchants and legal scholars had to engineer incredibly creative financial workarounds. In the Islamic world, they developed the mudaraba.
And what was that?
It was an advanced profit-sharing arrangement. One party provided the financial capital, while the other party provided the labor and undertook the physical risk of the voyage. If the voyage was successful and the goods were sold at a premium, they split the profits at a pre-agreed contractual ratio.
It fundamentally shifted the relationship. It wasn't a loan yielding fixed interest. It was an equity investment. The financier is sharing the risk of a shipwreck or pirates.
Exactly that mechanism. And in Christian Europe, particularly in the bustling city-states of Italy, merchants developed a very similar contract called the commenda.
Ah, the Italians.
Yes. Specifically, the great banking families of Florence, like the Medici, operating between the 12th and 15th centuries. They took financial abstraction to a completely new level. They effectively invented the architecture of modern banking.
Here is where it gets really interesting, because the Italian bankers solved the problem of trust across distances through a supreme accounting innovation: double-entry bookkeeping.
Which sounds boring, but it changed the world.
Before this, a merchant might just keep a running list of who owed him what, right?
A single column. But double-entry bookkeeping demanded that every single transaction be recorded in two separate columns, a debit and a credit.
Okay, break that down for me.
So if you lend money, your cash asset goes down, but your accounts receivable asset goes up. It created a closed, mathematically balanced system. It allowed a banking family with branches in Florence, London, and Bruges to maintain a unified, auditable view of their entire global operation.
Because errors or fraud became glaringly obvious, the books just wouldn't balance.
Exactly. And this mathematical trust enabled their next massive innovation, the bill of exchange.
Okay, picture this for a second. Imagine you are a wealthy merchant in Florence, and you need to purchase raw wool in Bruges, hundreds of miles away. Traveling with a wagon full of gold florins across the Alps through medieval Europe is essentially volunteering to be murdered by bandits.
Yeah, it was terrifying. The physical transport of bullion was the single greatest bottleneck to European economic growth. So our Florentine merchant bypasses the danger entirely.
Oh.
He deposits his physical gold with the local Medici bank branch in Florence. The banker takes the gold, enters a credit in his double-entry ledger, and writes the merchant a highly specific, cryptographically secure piece of paper, a bill of exchange.
And what does the paper say?
This paper instructs the Medici branch in Bruges to pay out the equivalent amount in local currency to the bearer.
So the merchant travels across Europe with nothing but a folded piece of paper sewn into his coat. He arrives in Bruges, hands over the paper to the local banker, and receives his purchasing power.
Yes.
This bill of exchange was basically a medieval wire transfer. It proved that money wasn't a physical thing anymore, it was a relationship and a social fiction.
You are absolutely right. The gold never crossed the Alps, only the information moved. The economy was no longer strictly limited by the brute logistics of dragging metal across the earth. It was limited only by how far a specific banking family's web of trust extended. Money was decoupling from the physical world.
But those European bills of exchange were still private claims, right? Like, they were backed by physical gold sitting in a vault somewhere. You could always demand the metal.
Yes, they were private promises.
But while the Italians were perfecting private credit, an empire on the exact opposite side of the world was experimenting with an economic concept that was vastly more radical and, frankly, terrifying to Europeans.
The origins of true paper money in China.
And that started earlier, didn't it?
It did. The Chinese trajectory was driven by a distinct logistical problem. During the Tang Dynasty, around the 7th century, the standard currency consisted of small bronze and copper coins.
Right.
Because these base metals had low intrinsic value, you needed millions of them for large merchant transactions. The sheer physical weight was crippling internal trade. You would need carts just to buy a house.
To solve this, Chinese merchants began depositing massive, heavy strings of copper coins at local government offices or merchant guilds, and in return, they received paper receipts called flying money.
I love that name, flying money. Because the paper receipts could fly across the country in the wind while the heavy copper stayed secured in the vaults.
But the massive paradigm shift occurred a few centuries later, during the Song Dynasty in the 10th century. The state recognized the immense power of the system and took over the issuance of these notes.
Right, creating the jiaozi. This was the world's first true government-issued paper money.
It requires such a profound psychological rewiring. To look at a fragile piece of paper completely devoid of any intrinsic value and collectively agree, yes, this is worth an estate or a herd of horses.
It is a massive leap of faith, and the value of that paper was derived entirely from state authority and coercion. If you want to understand the stark difference between European private credit and Chinese state fiat, you just have to look at the reaction of Marco Polo.
Marco Polo visiting the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol Empire under Kublai Khan in the 13th century.
Yes, the historical account is brilliant because he is utterly losing his mind over what he is witnessing.
He described how the emperor's officials strip the inner bark of mulberry trees, they process it into thick paper, stamp it with the emperor's official red seal, and literally just declare it to be legal tender.
Marco Polo writes that the emperor forces everyone in his vast kingdom, under absolute mandate, to accept this mulberry bark as payment for pearls, gold, and silk.
And the crucial enforcement mechanism was state violence. Refusal to accept the emperor's paper or attempting to forge it was punishable by immediate death.
So if you are wondering how a piece of mulberry bark suddenly bought a house in the 13th century, you have to understand the violence backing it up.
But why was Marco Polo so shocked? Didn't he come from Venice, the land of the Bill of Exchange? He knew about paper money?
It is the crucial distinction in monetary history. European bills of exchange were a private, voluntary contract. They were a claim on a tangible asset. If you held a Medici bill, you had a legal right to retrieve physical gold. The Chinese paper money Marco Polo encountered was fiat money. The word fiat comes from Latin, meaning let it be done. It is value by absolute sovereign decree.
So the mulberry bark was not a claim on a gold coin.
No. Though mulberry bark was the coin, the state had simply declared paper to be wealth.
And unfortunately, the Chinese empires learned the exact same painful lesson about state monopolies that the Romans learned with their debased silver denarius.
Yes, they did. The mechanics of inflation are relentless, regardless of the medium. The Yuan dynasty and subsequently the Ming dynasty faced massive state expenses, funding standing armies, fighting wars, maintaining the bureaucracy.
And the temptation was just too great.
It always is. They simply printed more and more paper money to cover their deficits. The supply of paper notes vastly outpaced the actual productive output of the economy.
So inflation ran rampant, the purchasing power of the paper collapsed, and despite the threat of execution, the public completely lost faith in the system. The economic chaos was so severe that China actually abandoned paper money entirely and reverted to a silver standard for centuries.
And in one of the greatest ironies of global economic history, precisely as China was abandoning paper to aggressively demand physical silver, Europe was about to stumble into the greatest, most violent influx of precious metals in the history of the human race.
The discovery of Potosi. The year is 1545. We are high in the Andes Mountains, in what is today modern Bolivia.
The historical account centers on an indigenous man named Diego Hualpa. According to the record, he was searching for a lost llama when a freezing snowstorm hit.
And to keep himself from sliding down the steep mountain, he grabbed onto a shrub. But the shrub pulled completely out of the ground.
And beneath the roots, exposed to the freezing air, he saw a glittering vein of pure silver. He had accidentally uncovered the Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. It was the largest, most concentrated deposit of silver ever found on Earth.
And the Spanish Empire mobilized to extract this wealth with a level of ruthlessness that is almost difficult to comprehend. The human cost of the global economy's next expansion was catastrophic.
It was horrifying. The Spanish colonial authorities instituted the mita system, which is a form of forced labor draft. It compelled hundreds of thousands of indigenous men to toil in the deep, freezing, highly dangerous shafts of the mountain.
And beyond the cave-ins and the brutal physical toll, the extraction process itself became lethal. Because to process the lower-grade silver ore, the Spanish relied on mercury amalgamation.
Right. The laborers were forced to stomp barefoot in massive vats of toxic mercury and crushed ore. The mercury poisoning was horrific. Potosi exploded into one of the largest, wealthiest boom towns on the planet, boasting global luxuries. And it was all built directly on top of unimaginable human suffering.
And the sheer volume of silver that the Spanish extracted and loaded onto galleons to ship across the Atlantic, it completely short-circuited the global economy. It triggered a macroeconomic phenomenon historians now call the price revolution.
The mechanics here are straightforward but devastating. Europe suddenly experienced a massive influx of physical silver. But the actual supply of goods, the grain, the cloth, the timber, did not increase at the same rate.
So when you have vastly more money chasing the exact same amount of goods, the value of the money plummets.
Exactly. Europe experienced a century of grinding systemic inflation. The price of everyday goods skyrocketed. It impoverished the working classes whose wages did not keep pace with the influx of bullion.
But this flood of silver also cemented a deeply flawed economic philosophy that would dominate European statecraft for centuries.
Mercantilism.
Right, mercantilism. This is the belief that a nation's wealth is mathematically equal to the literal amount of gold and silver sitting in its sovereign treasury.
It frames global economics as a strict zero-sum game. If wealth is defined strictly as physical bullion, then the total amount of wealth in the world is fixed.
Yes. So if France wants to become richer, it must ensure that it exports more goods than it imports, hoarding the resulting silver. Or, more bluntly, it must build a navy and violently conquer someone else's gold.
This philosophy justified and drove centuries of brutal colonial extraction and endless European wars. Because if you genuinely believe that money is gold, the only way to expand your economy is to violently dig more of it out of the earth. But while empires were bleeding each other, dry hoarding bullion, the next great, quiet monetary evolution was happening in the jamp, secure shops of 17th century English goldsmiths.
Ah, the goldsmiths. This is such an elegant structural pivot in the entire story of money.
It really is. So in 17th century London, goldsmiths obviously worked with large quantities of precious metals. Naturally, they possessed massive, highly secure iron safes.
Right.
And wealthy merchants and nobles began approaching them, recognizing that keeping gold in a private home was a severe security risk. They would pay the goldsmith a small fee to lock their gold in his impregnable safe.
And the goldsmith would take the physical gold and hand the customer a written paper receipt.
Yes. Over time, the public realizes that these goldsmith receipts are, well, as good as gold. If I owe you money, it is much easier and safer for me to simply hand you the goldsmith's paper receipt than to walk to the goldsmith, withdraw the heavy gold, walk across town, hand you the gold, only for you to walk back to the goldsmith to deposit it again.
So the paper receipts began circulating as currency in the streets of London.
Exactly. But then, a goldsmith observes a statistical reality that changes the world. He notices that on any given day, maybe only 5 out of 100 customers actually come into the shop to withdraw their physical gold.
Meaning the vast majority of the gold just sits there, completely inert, gathering dust in the dark vault.
Right. So the goldsmith thinks, what if I lend out some of this idle gold to a merchant who needs capital for a voyage, and I charge him interest?
But the goldsmith does not even hand the borrower physical gold, does he?
No. He just writes the borrower a new paper receipt.
Wait, so the goldsmith is now issuing more paper receipts than he actually has physical gold in his vault? He is functionally creating new money out of thin air, backed by the creditworthiness of the borrower.
That is the exact mechanical origin of modern fractional reserve banking.
It is like an ancient game of musical chairs. Let me try an analogy here for you listening. Imagine a massive global casino where you have 1,000 players, but only 100 chips actually exist in the vault. The casino manager realizes that not everyone cashes out at the same time, so he issues 1,000 paper vouchers representing chips. The game continues to expand, bets get larger, the economy grows,
Right.
and the system works flawlessly. The money supply expands to meet the needs of credit and commerce, as long as everyone doesn't rush the cashier's cage on the exact same afternoon.
And that rush to the cashier's cage is the phenomenon of the bank run. When a rumor spreads that the goldsmith has issued too many receipts, panic sets in. The trust evaporates.
Everyone rushes to demand their physical gold at once.
And the goldsmith cannot honor all the claims simultaneously. The bank collapses and the paper money becomes worthless. Fractional reserve banking is the engine of modern capitalism because it frees the money supply from the strict limits of mining, but it introduces an inherent systemic fragility.
Which required governments to step in. A system this elastic and this fragile couldn't just be left to private jewelers.
Precisely. In 1694, England found itself fighting exhausting, massively expensive wars against France. The government was functionally broke and struggling to secure loans. A Scottish entrepreneur named William Patterson proposed a radical structural solution:
What was it?
create a joint stock bank. Private investors would pool massive amounts of capital and lend it exclusively to the government. In exchange for funding the state's war debt, the government would grant this institution the exclusive privilege to issue official banknotes backed by the nation's debt.
Thus, the Bank of England was born.
Exactly, the first true blueprint for a central bank, an institution explicitly designed to manage the elastic money supply and fund the state.
But the transition to paper credit wasn't a smooth ride, was it? The early 18th century was plagued by chaotic, catastrophic financial experimentation.
Oh, absolutely. The most infamous example is the South Sea Bubble of 1720. A joint stock company called the South Sea Company was granted a monopoly on British trade in South America. The company took on the British national debt in exchange for issuing stock.
And a massive, irrational, speculative frenzy took hold of London. Everyone from peasants to the aristocracy bought shares on credit. The stock price detached entirely from economic reality, skyrocketing before inevitably and violently collapsing.
It wiped out fortunes across Britain. The psychological trauma of the South Sea Bubble and similar paper money disasters in France around the same time created a deep cultural distrust of elastic paper money. The public demanded an anchor. They demanded tangible reality.
And to instill absolute trust and put a leash on the chaos of infinite paper credit, the global economy slowly retreated into what we now call the classical gold standard.
Right. The gold standard of the 19th century was a system where each unit of a nation's currency was strictly, legally tied to a specific fixed weight of physical gold. A British pound was legally defined as 113 grains of pure gold.
And as the British Empire expanded its unprecedented global hegemony, the gold standard became the international norm. And it felt incredibly safe. It gave the illusion of perfect stability. The government could not just print money to fund whatever war or domestic program it wanted. Its hands were tied by the literal amount of physical gold sitting in the vaults of the central bank.
It was an excellent stabilizing system for a relatively peaceful, rapidly expanding 19th century global economy. It facilitated massive international trade by stabilizing exchange rates. If a pound is a fixed amount of gold and a franc is a fixed amount of gold, merchants know exactly what their money is worth across borders.
But it possessed a fatal flaw. The gold standard was completely, rigidly inflexible in a crisis. Under the gold standard, the supply of money is determined by the arbitrary luck of geology and mining output, not by the actual demographic or economic needs of human beings.
The gold standard was a fair weather ship. It sailed beautifully in calm waters. But in August 1914, the global economy sailed into a Category 5 hurricane.
World War I.
Yes. When a nation enters an industrial total war, national survival requires government spending on a scale that is mathematically impossible under the constraints of a gold standard.
Right. If European powers had kept their currencies tied to gold in 1914, they would have run out of money to buy artillery shells and pay soldiers within months. The war would have ground to a halt.
So practically overnight, every major belligerent power suspended the convertibility of their paper money into gold.
They severed the anchor, they fired up the printing presses to fund the slaughter in the trenches.
And we know exactly what the mechanical consequence is when a state turns on the printing press without restraint to fund deficits. We saw it in ancient Rome with the debased denarius. We saw it in the Yuan dynasty with the mulberry bark.
And we saw it in its most terrifying, mathematically extreme modern form in Germany between 1921 and 1923, the Weimar hyperinflation.
Yes. Following their defeat in World War I, Germany was crippled by massive war reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. The demands were explicitly payable in foreign currency or gold, not in German paper marks.
And the Weimar government was functionally bankrupt. They could not tax their devastated post-war population heavily enough to pay the victorious Allied powers. So they resorted to the only tool they had left.
They just kept printing marks, using those newly created marks to buy foreign currency to pay the reparations.
When you print currency to pay external debts without generating any internal economic value, you destroy the currency's internal purchasing power. The velocity of the money supply went terminal.
The stories from the sources are haunting. People taking wheelbarrows full of cash to the bakery just to buy a single loaf of bread and finding that the price of the bread had doubled while they were walking there.
Children building forts out of stacks of worthless multi-million mark banknotes in the street because the paper was cheaper than toys.
Prices were doubling every 3 to 4 days. It fundamentally destroyed the life savings of the German middle class. It obliterated their trust in liberal democratic institutions and deeply radicalized the political landscape, contributing directly to the societal desperation that fueled the rise of authoritarianism.
But even after the dust of World War I settled, the global attempt by central bankers to stubbornly reinstate the gold standard ended up amplifying the next great macroeconomic tragedy, the Great Depression.
That is a crucial point to linger on. How exactly did the rigid rules of the gold standard make the Great Depression worse?
Well, because of that inherent inflexibility. In a massive deflationary spiral like 1929, where banks are collapsing, demand is plummeting, and unemployment is skyrocketing, an economy desperately needs its central bank to lower interest rates and inject liquidity, to make borrowing cheap so businesses can survive.
But under the rules of the international gold standard, countries that were experiencing trade deficits and losing physical gold to other nations actually had to raise interest rates.
They had to raise rates to artificially attract foreign capital and gold back into their domestic vaults to maintain the legal peg, even while their domestic economy was suffocating.
Exactly. The rules of the gold standard demanded that central banks actively strangle the global economy in the middle of a depression. Countries only began to recover economically when they finally severed the golden handcuffs and allowed their currencies to float.
Britain abandoned the standard in 1931. The U.S. followed in 1933 under FDR. By the outbreak of World War II, the classical gold standard was completely dead, which meant, as World War II drew to a close, the world needed to build a completely new architecture for global money.
Enter the Bretton Woods Conference, July 1944. Hundreds of delegates gather at the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire.
World War II is still raging in Europe and the Pacific, but 44 allied nations gather to figure out how the global economy will physically function once peace is declared. And the sources paint this as an epic, intellectual heavyweight bout between two men with vastly different visions.
On one side, you have John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most famous economist of the 20th century, representing the fading, financially exhausted British Empire. Keynes envisions a radical, mathematically balanced global system. He proposes the creation of a new, politically neutral global currency called the banker.
The banker.
Yes, this currency would be managed by an international clearing union designed to force both debtor nations and creditor nations to share the burden of trade imbalances.
Meaning, if a country exported too much and hoarded too much banker, they would be penalized, forcing them to spend and stimulate the global economy. It was designed to prevent any single nation from dominating.
But in the other corner, you have Harry Dexter White representing the United States, and White basically says, that is a theoretically beautiful idea, John, but the United States currently holds the vast majority of the world's physical gold. Our industrial base is completely untouched by bombs, and we are funding this war. We're going to do it my way.
And White's pragmatic, power-driven vision prevailed. The Bretton Woods system created a modified, heavily centralized gold standard with a massive geopolitical tilt. The U.S. dollar was legally pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce, and every other major currency in the world, the pound, the franc, the mark, was pegged not to gold but to the U.S. dollar.
Meaning the U.S. dollar effectively became the sun at the center of the global economic solar system. It became the ultimate global reserve currency.
The French finance minister in the 1960s famously called this America's exorbitant privilege.
Because the entire world now needed U.S. dollars to conduct international trade, to buy oil, to buy steel, the United States could run massive, perpetual trade deficits without facing the severe currency crises that would cripple any other nation.
They could simply print dollars to fund the Vietnam War or massive domestic Great Society programs, essentially exporting their inflation to the rest of the world because global demand for dollars absorbed the excess supply.
But there is a mathematical catch, a ticking time bomb built into Bretton Woods called the Triffin dilemma.
I'll use the casino analogy again. If the global economy keeps expanding, it needs more chips, more dollars to function. The U.S. happily prints those dollars. But eventually, the sheer volume of paper dollars floating around the globe in foreign central banks is going to vastly exceed the amount of actual physical gold sitting in Fort Knox, backing them up at $35 an ounce.
And by the late 1960s, foreign nations, particularly France, did the math. They look at the massive inflation generated by U.S. spending, look at the pile of paper dollars they held, and realize the U.S. did not have the physical gold to back those claims. So they started showing up and exercising their legal right under Bretton Woods. They asked the U.S. Treasury to exchange their paper dollars for physical gold bars.
It was a slow-motion bank run on the United States of America.
The U.S. gold reserves were plummeting at an alarming rate. If the trend continued, the U.S. would default on its international obligations. So in August 1971, President Richard Nixon convenes a secret economic summit at Camp David. And on a Sunday night, without consulting the international community, he goes on national television and unilaterally announces that the United States is temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold.
Temporarily.
It was permanent. The Nixon shock effectively severed the final fraying cord tying global money to a physical commodity. The gold window was slammed shut.
So what does this all mean? It means since 1971, the entire globe has been running on pure fiat money, a system where money has value purely because the government says it does, and we all agree to believe them.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, fiat money is incredibly powerful but inherently fragile. Central banks now manage the economy targeting a 2% inflation rate to avoid deflationary spirals. They use interest rates and quantitative easing, literally creating billions of digital dollars to stimulate the system.
But this fiat system gave central banks immense power. And the 2008 financial crisis, born from opaque mortgage-backed securities and the collapse of Lehman Brothers, shattered public trust in these centralized institutions. Out of that shattered trust, a completely new kind of money was born.
In October 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto published the Bitcoin white paper. And the philosophical roots here are crucial. It was a direct response to 2008 bailouts, evidenced by the message embedded in the Genesis block referencing bank bailouts.
It countered fiat inflation by capping the supply at 21 million coins. It utilizes the blockchain and immutable decentralized public ledger. Later, Ethereum added smart contracts that automate transactions without human middlemen.
But people call cryptocurrency a trustless system. Isn't that a misnomer? You're trusting a protocol, cryptography, and a network of miners.
Exactly. And the volatility is massive. Bitcoin hit nearly $70,000 in 2021. And while proponents see it as an escape from inflation, critics point to energy consumption and volatility. We also have to mention central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, like China's digital yuan. They offer programmable economic stimulation, but also the risk of absolute state surveillance.
Whether a cowrie shell, a digital dollar, or a Bitcoin, the psychological weight of wealth remains exactly the same.
Which brings us to Aristotle's distinction between oikonomia, household management for genuine needs, and crematistics, the pursuit of money for its own sake, which he considered a kind of madness. Modern psychology even shows how money can prime people for solitary, less cooperative behavior.
And historically, Thomas Piketty observed that wealth tends to concentrate because the rate of return on capital typically exceeds economic growth.
It's like gravity. Unless there's an active force pushing back, money naturally clumps together. So every time you tap your card, you are participating in the oldest, most complex social institution in human history. You are renewing that fragile trust.
And as we enter an era of artificial intelligence and sweeping automation, if human labor is no longer the primary engine of the economy, how will we distribute wealth? Will the definition of money have to evolve again when the link between labor and survival is broken by machines?
How do you build a society when the old ledger no longer applies? I highly encourage you to mull over that question tonight. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. We'll see you next time.